Hey everyone, Father Lane here. I'm happy to have you for another class in our course on the Pauline letters, and you'll see here we are in the left field corner at Marlins Park in Miami, home of Cafecito Time between the top and the bottom of the fifth inning. I'll talk a little bit more later about why we're in Miami for this particular class. In our last class, we began our journey down the exegetical highway with St. Paul, and I mentioned we were going to answer 7 questions. What, who, where, when, why, how, and so what. Today we're going to begin with the first question, what? And we're going to look at 4 specific things. What is it that we're reading when we're interpreting one of Paul's letters? And it begins with the first item, what exactly is the text that Paul wrote? This is the matter that we biblical scholars call textual criticism. Now, those of you who've taken scripture courses before, you've probably had, at least in your introductory course, something about textual criticism. Experience has taught me that that was probably a few years ago, and so a little review is in order. Textual criticism tries to figure out what exactly were the words that St. Paul wrote down when he first wrote his letter, or what were the original words of any ancient text. We don't have the original copy or the original autograph of what Paul wrote. Instead, we have to rely on a number of ancient manuscripts, a number of ancient texts that were written by hand on papyrus or on parchment or in books, ancient texts. Unfortunately, when we look at these different manuscripts, they don't all say the same thing. We have an example here from Galatians chapter 1. In verse 15, "But when God, who from my mother's womb had set me apart and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me," that word in red, God, it's not present in some of the manuscripts. Sometimes, by contrast, it would just say, "but when he," and the he would be understood. It's not explicit in the text. How do we know this? You'll see on your screen here, around the Greek words ho theos, you'll see there are 2 blue square brackets. That's your indication that textual scholars are uncertain if those words were in the original text. And you'll notice there's a little rectangle out to the left of the first square bracket and a little slash after the second square bracket. That tells you that those multiple words were missing. There's a bunch of symbols, and if you go on Verbum and you hover over the symbol, it'll tell you what it means. This tells us that those 2 words, ho theos, Greek for the God, or applied to the true God, simply God, that those words aren't present in some of the manuscripts. Which manuscripts? On the left of your screen, you'll see the critical apparatus. The critical apparatus is a convenient way of listing which manuscripts have certain words or don't have certain words or have modifications. So looking at this critical apparatus, I can see that a couple of very ancient manuscripts, Papyrus 46 and Codex Vaticanus, another ancient manuscript, don't have this word, whereas some other ancient manuscripts, a number of other ancient manuscripts do. The most important question we're trying to answer when we do textual criticism is which reading is most likely. And the best way to do that is to discern which reading best explains how all the others may have developed by accident or even sometimes intentionally. In this case, a couple of possibilities exist. One is that the copyist saw the words ho theos, but then saw the next words, which were ho aphorisas, and he lost his place. He skipped over the first Greek word for the, ho, and went to the second. He lost his place. We call that a haplography, where by accident a copyist deletes something. Another possibility is that one of the copyists thought the grammar was a little unclear, and he wanted to make clear who the subject of the sentence was. I would point out, though, that like many text critical problems in the New Testament, it's a debate that's not an easy one to answer, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter in terms of interpreting what the text means. So that was our first issue, textual criticism. A second issue that we ask when we look at what am I reading, the limits of the text. Limits of the text refer to when does the text begin and end. As we know, when we read the Bible, we often don't have time to read the entire biblical book. We may not have time to read 6 chapters of Galatians. People would complain if they were at Mass and we read all 6 chapters of Galatians, much less all 150 Psalms. So what we do is we choose a logical place to begin and end. But we want to make sure when we're analyzing the Bible, when we're doing any kind of study, we have a coherent reason for starting one place and ending in another, lest we misrepresent what the inspired author is trying to tell us. We always want to have a reason. A number of good reasons exist. For example, there's a change in audience. Paul is addressing himself to one group and now turns and addresses another group. Another is that he changes his topic, or he employs a clear transition word in his vocabulary, or we'll sometimes notice as we read the letters that he has a pattern. So when he changes topics, he does the same thing. In the letter to the Galatians, he directly addresses his audience. So that's an indication, a new major unit is beginning. One reason why we should not automatically assume that we've got a change of topic or that we've got a new passage beginning is that there's a change of chapter or verses. The chapters and verses were added over the centuries. While they might be helpful when referencing the text, they don't carry any authority when it comes to discerning where a text begins or ends. Our next issue is the question of the genre of the letter. What am I reading when I read a Pauline letter? We know that St. Paul took the genre of the Greco-Roman letter, the kinds of ordinary letters that existed in Paul's time. You can see an example of one on your screen, that they contained a lot of the same basic elements of a letter that we have in our letters today. There's an identification of the sender and the addressee, there's a greeting, there's a thanksgiving. That was a little bit different back in the ancient world. There's the main body of the message, and then there's some final wishes before the closing. St. Paul takes that same basic structure, but does a few things differently. You'll see we have 5 main parts of a Pauline letter. There's an opening formula, a thanksgiving. Paul takes what in the ancient world usually was a thanksgiving to the gods, and Paul substitutes a clear Christian profession of his faith. He uses it, he uses this time to teach and to really describe in detail what he understands about the meaning of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. And then, of course, he has his body, final wishes and exhortations, and a concluding formula. Paul demonstrates a certain artistry with the ancient letter format, much like how Marlins Park exemplifies artistry applied to a ballpark. If you go to Marlins Park, you might feel like you're in a modern art gallery. There's a lot of different art around the ballpark. Some of it may have been a little over the top. The famous home run sculpture was removed a couple years ago. No, not before I got a selfie with it, before it went away. But anyhow, in the same way, Paul takes the ancient letter format and adds a profession of his faith to it. We see a good example of this in his introduction to the letter to the Galatians. Incidentally, Galatians is the one letter that doesn't have a thanksgiving. Paul is so upset with the Galatian Christians, he doesn't have time to give thanks. He has to get to the point of explaining why he's ticked off, but we'll explore that a little bit later. Here, Paul says, Paul, an apostle not from human beings, nor through a human being, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead. We're not one verse into Galatians, and St. Paul is already professing faith in the resurrection and professing faith in the union between the Father and the Son. That's a lot of theology just for a greeting, just for an introduction to a letter. This is common in Paul's letters. Finally, our fourth point when we're asking ourselves, what are we reading? We want to be aware of a key distinction that scholars use when reading Paul's letters. They ask 2 questions. Is this letter originally one letter? That is, what I read in the canon as one letter, has it always been so? Has it always been one letter? That quality of a letter being united, being one letter, is what we call unity of a letter. A distinct but related term is the integrity of a letter, which asks the question, has this letter seen any insertions? Have there been any interpolations added to the letter? These questions come up especially when we look at the Corinthian letters, when we look at 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So we'll explore them in greater detail there. But for now, let's be aware of that distinction between unity and integrity and how we ask that question when we approach one of Paul's letters. So that is what's in a Pauline letter. In our next class, we'll look at more about who St. Paul is. Who is the author of these letters? Until that time, read well and